billionaire mocked the single dad's patched coat. Then the auction house sold his watch for millions. The evening of the preview gala, the great auction house on the avenue was full of people who had come to be seen wanting things, and through the marble lobby, in a heavy wool overcoat that had been mended so many times the patches had patches, walked a slight, silver-haired man named Vartan Adishian, carrying, in an inner pocket over his heart, the only thing of value he had left in the world. He was 55, slight and a little stooped from a life bent over a workbench, with warm olive skin, soft silver hair combed back, a neat short silver beard, and gentle dark eyes behind half-moon glasses he wore low on his nose. His hands were small and exact and spotted now with age. He wore the patched overcoat over a threadbare suit pressed to a shine, and on his left hand a plain wedding band he had not taken off in the 3 years since Sona died, and on his right wrist, half hidden by a frayed cuff, a watch so old and scratched that no one in that lobby would have given $1 for it. He repaired cheap watches in a shop the size of a closet, and he did the work the way he did everything, without hurry and without complaint. And he had come, after 3 years of being unable to part with it, to consign the one treasure his father had left him, because his daughter needed things he could not give her on what a closet-sized shop brought in. Beatrice Lowell owned the evening, or believed she did. She was 54 and one of the great private collectors of the age, a billionaire who bought beautiful things the way other people breathed, and she came through the lobby in something black and architectural and stopped when she saw the man in the patched coat, the way you stop at a stain on a clean floor. "Good heavens," she said not quietly, to the dealer at her elbow. "They've started letting the public consign. Look at that coat. And is that," she peered, delighted, at his frayed wrist, "is that a watch or a bottle cap? Someone direct him to the pawnshop. He's wandered 3 blocks too far north." A few people laughed the soft laugh that follows money. Vartan Adishian looked at her for 1 second longer than a man in a patched coat was supposed to, not angry, only steady and a little tired, the way a man looks at weather he has decided to walk through. And then he turned and gave his name to the consignment desk, because that was what he had come to do. And he did not touch his cuff, though his hand wanted to, because the watch under it was worth more than every object in that room, and the only person who knew it was him. He had mended that coat himself, at the same bench where he mended watches, small even stitches. Because a thing did not have to be new to be cared for, and he had stopped long ago being ashamed of caring for old things in a world that only wanted new ones. In the pocket of the patched coat, folded small, was a child's drawing, a house and a sun, and 2 stick figures holding hands, and Beatrice Lowell never saw it, and he did not show her. The watch went up to the specialist's room that night, into the hands of the house's senior horology expert, a woman in her late 60s named Margaret Pell, who had spent 40 years handling the finest timepieces on earth and believed there was nothing left that could surprise her. She unclipped the scratched old case from the frayed strap and opened the back and looked into the movement and went absolutely still. Then she sat down, because her knees had stopped trusting her. She had seen this movement before, only once, in a photograph in a monograph described as lost. It was a grand complication of impossible delicacy, a thing that should not have been possible to make by one pair of hands, tiny wheels within wheels, doing things that the great houses with their teams and their machines could barely manage, and every bridge and every screw inside it finished by hand to a standard she had spent 40 years not quite seeing matched. And it was signed, inside, where only another watchmaker would ever look, with a maker's mark she knew the way she knew her own mother's voice. Adishian, the lost final masterpiece of Hovens Adishian, the obscure genius the trade had half forgotten, dead poor and unknown 40 years, his few surviving works selling for fortunes under other men's names. She sat in the bright, quiet specialist's room with the loop still in her eye and felt the shame of 40 years rise in her like a tide. because she had handled some of those other works, catalogued them under the wrong names, and had wondered, quietly, and said nothing. And the slight man in the patched coat who had carried it in over his heart had given his name at the desk as Edition. Margaret Pell took off her glasses and held the old watch in both hands, and understood that the shabby man they had nearly turned away was the son of the greatest watchmaker no one had ever heard of, and that he had been wearing a multi-million-dollar masterpiece on a frayed strap under a patched cuff to a job repairing other people's cheap watches. She went to find him the next morning at the closet-sized shop, and she introduced herself, and she told him, gently, sitting down, because she had learned that people needed to be sitting for this, what he had brought her. "I know what it is," Vartan said quietly, and poured her tea from a battered pot, "because that is what you do for a guest, even when she has come to tell you that you are not as poor as you thought. It is my father's last and best. He made it the year he died. He died believing his life had come to nothing, you understand, because a man in this trade had spent 30 years buying his work for pennies and selling it as other makers or under no name at all. And my father never had the papers or the lawyers or the language to fight it, and so he died unknown, and I grew up watching the most beautiful things human hands ever made go onto rich men's wrists with the wrong name inside." He turned his teacup. "I kept this one. The best one. I could not sell the others, they were already gone, sold out from under him while he lived. But this one he gave to me, and I have worn it under my sleeve for 40 years, where no one could put the wrong name in it. My wife used to say I should sell it and rest. I could not. It was the only place my father's true name still lived." "Then why now?" Margaret asked. "Because my Sona is gone," Vartan said, "and there is only my daughter now. And a watch you cannot put a roof under is not a kindness to a child. Sarah is 8. She should have what I can give her." He looked at the old expert. "But I want it sold with his name inside it read out loud. That is my one condition. I do not care so much about the money. I have carried that name on my wrist for 40 years. Before it leaves me, the world should say at once, correctly, from the back of the shop a small voice said, 'Papa, the kettle,' and a girl of about 8 came out, dark-haired, with her grandfather's exact dark eyes, and looked at the elegant visitor with the frank assessment children give to strangers. 'This is Sarah,' Vartan said. 'Sarah, this lady understands watches. Say hello and then finish your reading.' The girl considered Margaret, then crossed the little shop, and, having decided something, held up a drawing, 3 figures, a man, a girl, and in the corner a woman with dark hair, holding hands under a yellow sun. Margaret took it in both hands like it was something that might break, because she had not been given anything for free in a very long time. Sebastian Roth was 66 and was the most celebrated watch dealer of his generation, a man whose attributions made markets, and his entire reputation and a great deal of his fortune rested on a secret 40 years old. It had been Sebastian Roth, as a young and hungry dealer, who had found Hovhannes Edition, the unknown genius working alone, and recognized the gift, and then, instead of championing it, devoured it. He had bought the old man's masterpieces for almost nothing, and sold them at enormous profit attributed to famous names or to an unknown master, and built his own legend as the great discoverer of fine watches on the back of a man he had kept poor and erased on purpose, because an unknown maker's work was a thing Roth could own, and a celebrated maker's work was not. When the lost final edition surfaced at the house's specialist's desk, with its maker's mark intact and the son's name on the consignment, Sebastian Roth understood at once that it was not merely worth millions. It was a key. Authenticated and sold with the edition name, read aloud, it would let scholars trace backward through 40 years of his attributions and find his frauds one by one. The watch could not be allowed to sell as an edition. So Sebastian Roth did the thing he had done his whole life. He went quietly to the shabby, trusting old man with a kindness that was a knife. He came to the closet-sized shop as a great expert, doing a poor man a favor. And he told Vartan, sorrowfully, that the house would take a brutal commission and that the piece was unfortunately unsignable, attribution uncertain, but that he, Roth, out of respect, would buy it privately, today for a fair sum, and spare him the auction's vultures. And he had brought a bill of sale already drawn. And a pen. Vartan Adishian, who had watched his father robbed by exactly such kindness, said no and showed the great dealer the door and poured out the tea he had offered him, because some guests do not deserve the cup. But Sebastian Roth did not become Sebastian Roth by taking no for an answer. That night a bill of sale appeared in the house's private treaty file, transferring the watch to a Roth entity for a modest sum. Dated that afternoon, signed in the name Vartan Adishian in a careful hand that was not his. It was Margaret Pell who found it, because Margaret Pell had been waiting 40 years for a reason, and the moment the Adishian surfaced, she had started watching Sebastian Roth the way you watch a snake you have finally cornered. She had known the whole of her career what Roth was. She had been a young cataloger once who had questioned an attribution and been told by her superiors to be quiet if she wished a career, and she had been quiet, and it had sat in her like a stone for 40 years. Now she pulled the private treaty file and found the forged bill of sale, and she pulled from her own home, where she had kept it all this time like a debt, a photocopy of an old workshop ledger in Hovhannes Adishian's own hand, listing the masterpieces Roth had bought for pennies, against the famous name attributions Roth had later sold them under. And a junior cataloger, who had grown tired of being told to be quiet, slipped Margaret a printout of an email from Sebastian Roth to a man who did discreet work. One line. The Adishian cannot sell under that name. Secure the piece privately tonight. Draw the paper. The old man won't know the difference until it's done. Margaret held the page and felt 40 years of being quiet come to an end. She brought it all to the consignor, because the consignor had a right to know, and she brought to the head of the house, because what she had was no longer about one watch. She went to the closet-sized shop on a Thursday, and this time Sarah opened the door first and looked up and said, "You're the watch lady." And Vartan came out from the bench with his loup pushed up on his forehead, and Margaret laid the forged bill of sale and the old ledger and the email on the workbench, and he understood at once. He read it slowly, the load-bearing part first, the way he read a movement. When he saw his father's own handwriting in the ledger, the list of stolen masterpieces, the proof of the long theft his father had died unable to prove, he set his small hand flat on the page and held it there, and his lip trembled once, and then the breath went out of him, and his hand opened again, deliberate, the way of a man who had decided long ago not to weep in front of his granddaughter's mother's memory or his daughter's eyes. Then he looked at the forged bill of sale, at the signature that was meant to be his, for a long moment. "That isn't my hand," he said quietly. "It is close. He got the V wrong. I cross my V at the base, the old way, the way my father wrote it, the way they teach you in a country that is gone now. This V is open, lazy, a man copying a shape he does not understand. He has been stealing my father's hand for 40 years, and he never once learned how a son of that hand signs his own name. He almost smiled, and it did not reach anywhere. He robbed my father while he lived and meant to rob him again now that he is dead, to keep him erased, because my father unerased is the end of him. 40 years I wore the truth on my wrist and could not make anyone look. And now a thief has handed me the reason they will have to." "There's a live auction Friday night," Margaret said. "The piece is in it." against my better judgment, because Roth has friends on the board who want it withdrawn and sold quietly to make the problem go away. If it goes to the block honestly, with what I have, the truth comes out in front of the whole trade. If it's withdrawn, your father stays erased and Roth wins one more time." She paused. "I have been quiet for 40 years, Mr. Addition. I would like, before I retire, to be loud exactly once." Vartan looked at her a long moment. Then he said, "Then we go Friday," and Margaret, who had expected to do this alone, found that she was not alone and did not remark on it, because she had already learned that with him the important things came quietly. Beatrice Lowell, who had mocked the patched coat, did not know any of this. But she was a serious collector, whatever else she was, and word had reached her. The way word reaches collectors, that the obscure lot, watchmaker uncertain, was perhaps something extraordinary, and that the great Sebastian Roth was strangely eager to make it disappear, which to a woman who had bought beautiful things for 40 years was the loudest possible signal that it was real. She came to the Friday sale intending to bid, and she did not yet know that the man whose coat she had laughed at was the son of the maker. Sebastian Roth learned that Margaret Pell had pulled the private file and the old ledger, and he moved the way frightened powerful men move, smoothly, leaning on the board to withdraw the lot, sending a man to the closet-sized shop to frighten an old watchmaker with talk of lawyers and uncertain attribution and the foolishness of fighting a man with friends. Vartan took Sarah to Sona's sister across the city and stood in the doorway and told her to lock everything and open for no one, and Sarah held his sleeve. "Are we in trouble, Papa?" she asked. "No, John," he said, the old word for dear. "For the first time in 40 years, somebody else is. And your great-grandfather, who you never met, is going to have his name said out loud the right way, in front of important people finally. I have waited my whole life for that, and I am not going to let a thief take it the night before." That night, alone in the shop, he did not need to take anything down from a closet, because the watch was already gone to the house and the rest of his father lived in his hands and his memory. But he took out the one photograph he had, his father at the bench, an old man with the same dark eyes and the same stoop Vartan now wore, holding a loupe to the light, unsmiling, because he had not had much to smile about. A genius who died believing he had failed. Vartan set it on the workbench and looked at it a long time. He did not cry, he had done that, 40 years of it, quietly at this bench. But something clenched in him since before his wife died, since before his father died, let go by 1 degree. Because for the first time he was not asking the world to believe him out of mercy. He had the proof, he had the thief's own hand. He had Margaret Pell, who had been quiet for 40 years and was done. He put the photograph in the breast pocket of the patched coat, over his heart where the watch had ridden in, and he went to bed, and he slept. The live auction filled the great sales room on Friday night. The chandeliers, the banks of phones, the collectors in the good seats, the dealers along the walls, Sebastian Roth in the front row, in a suit that cost what Vartan made in a year. Certain the lot would be quietly withdrawn because he had spent 40 years being certain. Beatrice Lowell sat 3 rows back with her paddle, and Vartan Aditian sat at the very back in the patched overcoat with Margaret Pell beside him, because Margaret had insisted he be in the room. The auctioneer reached the lot and read it as the catalogue had it, a fine, complicated watch, maker uncertain, and Sebastian Roth allowed himself the smallest smile, and that was when Margaret Pell rose from the back of the room and asked, in the clear carrying voice of a woman who has been quiet for 40 years, to address the room before the lot was sold. She had cleared it with the head of the house, who was tired of Sebastian Roth too. She walked to the front, and she held up the old watch so the chandeliers caught it, and she said, "This catalogue is wrong, and I wrote it, and I am correcting it now, in front of all of you, because I should have done it 40 years ago. This is not a watch by an uncertain maker. This is the lost final masterpiece of Hovhannes Edician, signed inside in his own mark, which I will show you, and it is consigned by his son, who is sitting at the back of this room in a coat some of you laughed at on Tuesday. The screen behind the rostrum lit, because Margaret had seen to it. The maker's mark inside the movement, magnified, the page of Hovhannes Edician's own ledger, the masterpieces and the false names they had been sold under, the forged bill of sale, the open lazy V beside Vartan's true crossed one, the difference ringed in red. And then the email, one line. The Edician cannot sell under that name. Secure the piece privately tonight. Draw the paper. The old man won't know the difference until it's done. For 40 years, Margaret said, the works of a great man have sold in this room, and others under names that were not his, because a dealer in this room found him poor and made sure he stayed unknown, because an unknown master's work could be owned and a famous one's could not. That dealer tried, this week, to buy this watch in the dark and forge the son's name to do it, so that the maker would stay erased and his own long fraud would stay buried. She looked at Sebastian Roth in the front row. His name is in the email on the screen. I have been quiet about him my entire career, and I am ashamed of it, and I am not quiet anymore. The room had gone utterly silent. Vartan Edician stood at the back in the patched coat, and every head turned. And he did not raise his voice. My father was Hovhannes Edician, he said. He made the most beautiful watches of his century and died believing he had made nothing, because a man stole his name a piece at a time. I wore this one under my sleeve for 40 years, so that one place on earth still held his true mark. I bring it here to sell, and I have one condition, the only one. Say his name. Sell it as his. That is all I ever wanted, and it is worth more to me than whatever you are about to pay for it. The auctioneer, to his lasting credit, set down his notes and corrected the lot aloud, the lost masterpiece of Hovhannes Edician, consigned by his son Vartan, and opened the bidding, and the room, which had come to buy beautiful things and had been handed something far rarer. A wrong made right in real time, bid the way rooms do when they know they are part of a story. The number climbed past what anyone had dreamed, past the high estimate and past it again. The phones lighting up as bidders in distant cities heard what was happening and came in. The paddles and the gasps, a hush, and then a fresh number, and then a hush. And the strange thing, the thing the trade would talk about for years, was that the longer it went, the less it felt like greed, and the more it felt like a room full of people each putting a hand on a thing to say they had been there the night it was set right. Near the end there were 2 bidders left, and one of them was Beatrice Lowell, who had laughed at the coat, and who now had tears standing in her eyes, and a paddle she would not lower. And she bought the lost Edician for a figure that made the room stand and applaud, and the applause was not for the price. It was for the old man at the back who had finally heard his father's name said correctly, out loud. Sebastian Roth had risen and was trying to leave, and at the doors 2 investigators were waiting, because the head of the house had made the calls that afternoon, and the email and the forged bill of sale and Margaret Pell's 40-year-old ledger were already with the authorities and the trade's governing body, and the unwinding of 40 years of false attributions had already begun. Roth, who had stayed celebrated for 40 years by being smooth, walked to them without a word, which was somehow worse than if he had run. In the weeks after, the story moved through the art and horology world, and then far beyond it, the erased genius and the son who wore the proof on his wrist for 40 years. Roth was charged with fraud and forgery, and a quiet army of scholars began the long work of restoring Hovhannes Edician's name to the dozens of masterpieces sold out from under it, so that in museums and collections around the world, one by one, the wrong names came down and the right one went up. Beatrice Lowell declined every interview and gave one written statement, 11 sentences long, and signed her name to it. And then she did a thing that surprised the trade. She lent the watch she had paid millions for back to a museum, to be shown publicly under the maker's true name. Because, she said, it had never really been hers to keep, only hers to give back to him. And Vartan Adityan, who was suddenly not poor, did the first thing with the money that a man like him would do. He set up a fund for independent artisans, working alone and unknown the way his father had. Watchmakers and makers of small, impossible, beautiful things, so that no genius would die erased for lack of papers and lawyers and someone to say his name. And he called it the Sona Adityan Fund, after his wife, who had loved his father's watch and had begged him for years to let it bring them rest before he had told anyone he was going to. Vartan did not move out of the neighborhood, though he could have bought the block. But he took the closet-sized shop and the one beside it and made a proper workshop. And he taught. Finally, the thing his father had had no one to teach, the old impossible methods, to young people who came from everywhere now that the Adityan name meant something again. He kept repairing cheap watches for the people in the neighborhood, too, the bus drivers and the grandmothers, for almost nothing, because the work asked only care, and care was the one thing he had never run out of. And because a man who has been looked through his whole life does not forget how it feels to have your small broken thing handled gently. On a gray morning in March, he went to the cemetery where Sona was buried, and Beatrice Lowell drove him, because by then she was driving him places, and she stayed 3 steps back while he crouched and set something on the grass before the stone, not the watch. That belonged to the world now, but the old photograph of his father at the bench in a small frame, because he wanted the two of them to keep each other company. She heard him say, "Lo," in the old language, and then in English so she would understand it later when he told her they said his name, Sona, the right way, in front of everyone. And then, softer, "You were right. It was time to let it rest. I only needed it to be his rest and not his erasing." He did not say more. Beatrice did not come closer. She understood that her place at that moment was not nearer, and that there are things a man says to a stone that a woman who once laughed at his coat is only allowed, now, to stand near, and not inside. Beatrice started coming by the workshop on the weekends, first to see the watch's paperwork and then for no reason at all, and she traded her architectural black for an apron that got machine oil on it, and learned the names of Sarah's library books, and let the girl beat her at a card game whose rules changed whenever Sarah was losing. One evening she watched Vartan teach Sarah to set a tiny wheel into a movement under the loop. His small spotted hands over the girl's smaller ones, slow, no wasted motion. The same care his father must have turned on the masterpiece now in a museum. "You do not force it," he told her. "A small thing knows when you are gentle and when you are not, just like a person." Sarah set the wheel true and looked up at him with the pride of a child trusted with a real thing, and Beatrice, watching from the doorway with a cup of tea going cold in her hand, understood that this was the whole of him, that the keeper of a stolen genius and the mender of cheap watches and the father were one quiet, unbroken man all the way down, and that she had looked at him in a marble lobby and seen only a coat. On a clear Saturday in spring, the three of them went to the museum to see the watch in its case, lit with Hovhan's Adityan on the card in letters a foot high, and Sarah read her great-grandfather's name aloud, slow and proud. And a young man stopped beside them and said he had come from another country just to see it because he was learning the old methods at the Adityan school. And he did not know he was speaking to the son, and when he found out, he could not let go of Vartan's hand. Sarah looked up and asked, "Are you going to stay with us forever?" Of Beatrice, the way children ask the questions adults are too careful to, and Beatrice glanced at Vartan, who had turned from the lit case and was looking at her. And she said, "I'm thinking about it." Vartan sent Sarah to read the next card, and the girl went, and he turned to Beatrice in the hush of the gallery, under the soft light on the thing his father had made. "You don't have to promise a child something you haven't promised yourself," he said, "especially this one. She has lost her mother. She does not collect people lightly, and she has collected you. I'm promising both of them," Beatrice said, at the same time. He looked at her a long moment, this woman who had laughed at his coat and then stood weeping with a raised paddle and given his father's watch back to the world. Then he raised his hand and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear with the back of one small spotted knuckle, the first time he had touched her in all the weeks she had been coming. She did not pull back. He did not move closer. It was a moment, no more, but it was long enough for both of them to know it had finally arrived. Sarah came running back to report that the next case was about clocks and slightly boring, and slipped one hand into her father's and one into Beatrice's and tugged them along to judge it for themselves, the way she did, as if this had always been the arrangement and she had only been waiting for the grown-ups to catch up. By summer, the Edician workshop had a bench for Sarah and a waiting list of students, and the old photograph of the man at the bench had come home from the cemetery to hang where Vartan could see it while he worked, because he had decided his father had kept Sona company long enough and belonged among the watches again. Beatrice let most of the old life go, the galas, the collecting, the rooms where a person was appraised at the door like an object, and she found by the third month that she did not miss any of it. A man had been mocked for a patched coat and a scratched old watch in a room full of people who bought beauty and could not see it. Some people wear their worth where the whole room can price it, on the coat, on the wrist, in the cut of the cloth. Others wear the greatest treasure of an age under a frayed cuff for 40 years. So that one place on earth still holds a robbed man's true name. And you only learn what that scratched old watch was worth when an honest woman opens the back of it and forgets how to stand.